Professor Buzzkill, busting myths, taking names. You know what's so great about being me is that I have the best historian friends in the world. And we were on the line with Professor Phil Nash last week talking about the Battle of Stalingrad in what became the first part of that episode. And here we are today back again to talk about part two because it's such a huge, it needed to be broken down into two pieces in order to really understand what's going on. Remember, we don't give you the History Channel version of everything here. We give you the much better version of everything here. So, Professor Nash, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
I'm happy to be here, as always.
Well, it is an amazing battle. You left us with a great cliffhanger. First of all, before the cliffhanger, we learned that, Hitler just screws this up 6 ways from Sunday. But then you talked about, at the end, all of that screwing up and winter setting in creates a great opportunity for the Soviets, ... So let's talk about that great opportunity. German concentration on Stalingrad creates that opportunity, which they were taking advantage of. And how were they doing that?
Right. How did they do that? Basically, the Germans have basically created this opening for the Soviets. Basically, remember that there's a bend in the German line. So the German line roughly comes from northwest to southeast along the Don River, sort of north of Stalingrad. At Stalingrad, it takes a bend, I don't know, maybe 120 degrees, I guess. It turns then due south.
Yeah.
And so basically, and Stalingrad is at the tip. Mm-hmm. And then you've got your flanks defended by far weaker Axis forces, mainly Romanians, but also Italians and Hungarians. I mean, not taking anything away from the Soviets, but it's sort of been given to you on a platter.
Right.
If you are building up forces that you can counterattack with, you really could easily attack on the German or the Axis flanks, break through, and surround all the German forces that are in Stalingrad.
Right.
So that's what the Soviets do. They plan what's called Operation Uranus. Mm-hmm. They start planning it in mid-September.
It's planet named after the planet.
It's named, yeah. In this period, the Russians have a whole bunch of operations. There's an Operation Mars, there's an Operation Saturn, and there's Operation Uranus. So it's a counterattack. And basically, here's, like I said, Stalin is getting better at the warlord thing. He lets his new deputy commander-in-chief, General Georgy Zhukov, he was basically the Eisenhower of the Soviets, if I can put it that way. He's probably their number one military commander of the war. He's very, very gifted, very, very tough. He takes charge on the Stalingrad front, and Stalin doesn't interfere very much with him. And what Stalin is doing is he's slowly letting merit rather than cronyism determine who gets senior command slots. And one of the reasons the Soviets have had disasters up until this point, on all fronts, by the way, some of the best Soviet commanders in the late 1930s were purged. They were either killed or sent to the Gulag. And the people who survived were often his cronies. And these are some of the people in senior positions in 1941 or early in 1942, and they don't do a very good job because they're cronies. They're not chosen. So Stalin is getting away from that, basically, and by putting people like Zhukov in charge in senior command slots. So they plan to attack on the flanks and basically encircle the German force in Stalingrad. The Germans miss this totally. This is yet another massive German intelligence fail. We've seen this elsewhere in World War II. I've talked about it in other shows. German intelligence often not very good. They miss the Soviet buildup, partly because they believe that the Soviet manpower has been used up. Mm-hmm. Hitler loves to believe this, based on very little evidence. They believe that the Soviets are, by the way, and they are, the Soviets have enough forces. They are also building up opposite Army Group Center, the German Army Group Center outside Moscow. So the Germans think maybe if the Soviets attack, it's going to be there. The Soviets are also relying on and becoming much better at what they call maskirovka, which is basically deception.
Yep.
So they're very careful. As they build up for this counteroffensive, they are very good about camouflaging their forces. They do a lot of movement at night, so they can't be spotted by German aircraft. At a certain point, they build bridges across the Don, and the bridges are about a foot below the surface of the water, so that you can't see the bridges very easily from the air.
This is amazing to me. It's amazing to me they were able to do
Isn't
that.
Like sort of like elegantly simple, sort of thing I would never think of. It's pretty clever, right? Because it's shallow enough that you can still drive a vehicle across it.
Oh well, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Right, but you wouldn't see it from the air. So there's a lot of deception, camouflage, build up at night. They move forces into place and then camouflage them so the Germans don't notice anything is happening. And the Germans also, for all these reasons, feel like they don't need to fear counterattack. They don't think the Soviets are capable, basically, of doing this. That they don't have the forces, and that they're not preparing any big attack on our flanks. It's even worse for the Germans, which they may not have noticed at the outset, is that they had failed to establish their line firmly on the Don, the entire stretch to the northwest of Stalingrad. In other words, there were places where the Soviets still had bridgeheads from earlier in the campaign. The Soviets had bridgeheads on the west side of the Don River. So in other words, they don't have to cross the river at certain points in order to counterattack. So it's even worse for the Axis than you might think. So really, really well set up for a Soviet counteroffensive, which Operation Uranus is launched on the 19th of November. And as you pointed out, this is right when the winter is setting in. The temperatures are plummeting. The Soviets are still much, much better equipped than the Germans when it comes to winter warfare. The Germans, it's not as bad as late 1941, but the Germans still don't have all the proper winter equipment, fur-lined boots and stuff like that, or fur hats, that sort of stuff. The Soviets attack on the 19th and then the 20th of September in two phases, first in the north and in the south, with over 1 million men. They have over 800 tanks available for this. And I should point this out because this is an interesting point made by some of the most recent scholarship, is that already in this part of the war in the East, Allied, particularly American Lend-Lease, is playing an enormous role in making this happening. The Soviets were loath to admit this at the time and even afterwards, but we have a much clearer picture now. Is that already in the fall of 1942, the Americans and the British are prioritizing the rushing of supplies to their Soviet allies, including lots and lots of armored vehicles, airplanes, trucks and jeeps in particular. This is when you start to see Soviet officers tooling around in American jeeps, Studebaker trucks. This is going to allow the Soviets to do this deep and very quick penetration that's going to bring them great success. So it's a double envelopment from the northwest of Stalingrad and the south of Stalingrad. Total surprise is achieved. Immediate deep penetrations. The Romanians in some cases fight rather well, but they're basically stomped on. They're pushed aside. They're spread too thin and they're too ill-equipped. I'll give you one example of this. The Romanian infantry divisions had basically 6 modern anti-tank guns per division.
6 up against all these hundreds of Soviet. Yeah.
6 anti-tank guns is what you would want like in a battalion with like 800 guys, not what you'd want in a division with 12 or 15,000 guys. In other words, that's essentially like having none at all.
Yeah. Right,
and remember, a lot of these Soviet tanks crashing toward you are T-34s. They're probably the best medium main battle tank of World War II. And most of the Romanian forces have these little 37 millimeter anti-tank guns, which are essentially pop guns. You know, their shells would bounce right off. And so the Romanians are quickly overrun. The Soviet pincers link up. So the one from the northwest and the one from the south, the pincers link up at Kalach in the German rear 4 days later.
That's super fast.
Super fast. I mean, so fast the Germans basically don't even have time to react properly. Now, by the way, they couldn't react properly anyway because they had, like I said, they only had weak reserve forces in the back. The lucky German forces and Axis forces are the ones that are swept aside and pushed to the west. In other words, they're not trapped in the pocket. Those are the lucky Axis forces. When the Soviets completed the encirclement, they figured they had bagged about 80,000 Axis forces. The actual number turns out to be closer to 300,000.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It's an enormous number. And that, by the way, another indication, your average army in World War II is probably around 100,000 men. That gives you an idea of how supersized the 6th Army was. It's about 22 divisions, give or take. That 300,000, and it depends how you count, but roughly it's about 210,000 German troops. The rest are Axis, so Romanians, or there's even a Slovakian regiment. And about 50,000 Hiwis, often overlooked. Hiwis, the Hilfswillige. These are former Soviet prisoners of war who are working for the Germans, usually in like labor, in a labor capacity. 50,000 of them are trapped in the pocket. And these are the people who are really, shall we say, dreading their futures.
Right.
Because they've done what I would argue is the logical thing, right? Their alternative was to die, like most Soviet prisoners of war died, of starvation and exposure. They were given the choice, basically, we'll feed you, but you work for us. And so there are 50,000 of them trapped in the pocket. There are also a few thousand Red Army prisoners of war that the Germans have captured in Stalingrad. They're the really unfortunate ones, because basically, when the supplies start to run low, the Germans are not going to feed them. And they're going to be liberated by the Soviets, and they're going to be like weighing 80 pounds each, and it's going to fire up the Red Army soldiers even more. So these 300,000 Axis forces and Hiwis are trapped in a football-shaped pocket that's about 40 miles long from east to west and 25 miles wide north to south. So it's not a small pocket. It's pretty big. And it's anchored in Stalingrad on its eastern tip. if people can visualize that. So the Germans are still in the city on the river. They still control most of the city. But then there's all this empty area at the back, which makes out the rest of the football-shaped pocket.
So how did the German high command react to this?
Von Paulus, the commander of 6th Army, who's now trapped with his army in this pocket, he asks for permission to break out. And there's a lot of speculation. Maybe a more clever or forceful commander would have maybe on his own authority broken out, or, I don't know, taken charge more firmly. Von Paulus asks Hitler if he can break out, which would have been possible in the first couple of weeks. Hitler refuses, and Hitler basically says, we will rescue you. We'll come to you, basically. We'll break through the ring that's around you and liberate you that way and reestablish a front. The commander of the new German Army Group Dawn, who's the brilliant German general Erich von Manstein, he's one of the best German generals in the war, I think consensus would agree. He also agrees with Hitler. Von Paulus doesn't have to break out. We can break into him. We can relieve him by breaking through the ring. And von Manstein, he's another one of these very slippery characters. After the war, he lies about this. After the war, he's trying to clean up his reputation, and he basically says, I didn't think we could rescue them. Yeah, dude, at the time you did. and that's part of the problem. That's part of the German thinking. The other part of the German thinking is, we'll build an air bridge.
Yeah, now this is fascinating.
It is. It's super important that, in other words, we have this army that's trapped behind enemy lines. We can fly supplies to them with transport aircraft and bombers. We'll build an air bridge. And here our good friend Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, he basically, without even looking into it, basically assures the Führer, look, we can keep them supplied by air.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons he said this is, and this is where the Germans sort of played themselves basically, earlier in 1942, much farther north in the Soviet Union, there was another German pocket trapped behind Soviet lines, and they had successfully supplied it by air. This is called the Demyansk pocket. People can look it up. This was south of Leningrad, earlier in 1942. But it's apples and oranges. This was a far smaller trapped force. It was supplied for a far shorter amount of time than Stalingrad's going to need, and there was much less Soviet opposition in the air. And, by the way, still significant losses were sustained in keeping this army alive and in breaking it out, basically. But it's unfortunate for the Germans in this point because it basically plays into the hands of Adolf Hitler, who is completely averse to giving up a single square inch of territory under any circumstances. It's one of the reasons the Germans lose World War II. In campaign after campaign, you saw this in North Africa, you see it over and over again, where Hitler says, stand and fight, and the Germans, rather than doing a tactical withdrawal, they get creamed. So Hitler's like, basically, we will supply you by air, sit tight, we'll arrange a rescue force that will break into the outside. That's the idea. Big picture, one of the problems with this, and one of the reasons it doesn't work, is that this is another, we talked about this in other shows, it's another great example of what Paul Kennedy once called imperial overstretch. In other words, the Germans have established an empire that is too big for them to defend, and they end up playing whack-a-mole. So the timing is crucial, right? This is September 19th to 23rd is when the army in Stalingrad is surrounded. This is right after Rommel has been defeated at El Alamein and is retreating very quickly toward the west. And Allied forces land in Operation Torch. We did a show on this in the invasion of Northwest Africa. So at this very moment, November into December 1942, significant German forces are being sent into Tunisia with the help of hundreds of transport aircraft. All of these ground and air forces might have been used on the Eastern Front to retrieve the situation at Stalingrad, but they weren't available because the Germans are trying to do too much with too little. Those forces that might have saved von Paulus and his army were not available. And so together, this refusal to let von Paulus break out in the early days of the encirclement and this idea that, we'll supply them by air, together these two ideas seal the fate of the Sixth Army.
Okay, so now why is that? Why do they seal the fate of the Sixth Army?
One big reason is the airlift turns out to be totally inadequate for the task. There are not enough transport aircraft, terrible weather, you mentioned the winter. There are some of these German airfields outside the pocket that are basically loading up and servicing these transport aircraft. They're operating out in the open in basically blizzard conditions. If you can imagine like a major airfield where all the air crew and the pilots and everyone are living in tents and it's like 10 below outside, can you imagine trying to service an aircraft with, big heavy mittens on, for example, and no aircraft hangars? So you got terrible weather, not enough transport aircraft. The Soviets are clever. They very quickly, they've got the Sixth Army surrounded. They deploy around the Sixth Army very, very dense anti-aircraft forces. Transport aircraft, especially as they get close to the pocket, they have to fly low, and they're very, very slow. These Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft the Germans rely so heavily on, they're very slow. So in other words, they're sitting ducks for Soviet anti-aircraft. A lot of them are blasted out of the sky and never make it. The numbers are not encouraging. The Sixth Army, it is calculated, needed about 750 tons of supplies a day.
A day, wow.
A day to continue fighting, right? That's fuel, that's ammunition, that's food. The average over the length of this encirclement, the average they get is about 105 tons. And I want to say, I forget the number. The best single day, I think, isn't even half of 750. So there are supplies that get through, but not nearly enough. And by the way, unless people think that the German military is somehow this marvel of efficiency, there are some unbelievably stupid decisions made. I've seen stories of transport aircraft landing inside the pocket, and they pull out all the crates, and they open the crates, and they find condoms.
Oh, God.
And my other favorite, they find a huge shipment of condiments, like salt and pepper.
Oh, yeah. You don't need boots or artillery shells. You need ketchup.
Yes,
and
I mean,
mustard.
it's almost like you've got these clerks with their clipboards, and they're like, well, we got to supply an army. So that means they need everything on this list. So let's just send it all. You know, and the plane that has rations might get shot down, and the one with the condoms might make it through. Pretty ridiculous. So the Germans do organize a relief operation under von Manstein. It's an operation called Winter Storm, Wintergewitter in German. It's launched on the 12th of December, so more or less a month after the encirclement has begun. This counteroffensive, tell me if you've ever heard this story before, it begins well at first.
Yeah.
It makes good progress on its way towards Stalingrad. There's a point where the troops trapped in Stalingrad can actually hear the guns in the distance, but this force is too small. The Soviets counterattack further west in Operation Little Saturn, which actually comes close to or threatens to encircle this relief column.
Wow.
And so it has to be called off. Winter Storm is called off on Christmas Eve. So it didn't quite last 2 weeks. And at that point, the Sixth Army is doomed because no one's coming to rescue you. And by this point, you are not in a position to break out yourself. Now, hindsight's 2020. Had von Paulus been ordered to break out at the same time you had an attempt to relieve him from the outside, who knows? Maybe that would have worked if it had been organized a little more quickly. But after almost a month, I have to wonder about any effort on the part of von Paulus to break out, because by this point, his army wasn't mobile anymore. They didn't have enough fuel. They had already started to eat their horses because of the lack of rations. And by the way, I didn't realize this. At the time of the encirclement, a lot of the horses of Sixth Army were being kept 100 miles to the west. In other words, they weren't in the pocket. So already by early December, I would argue that the mobility of the Sixth Army and thus its ability to break out was extremely limited. So it's possible that an attempt to break out wouldn't have worked in any case. I would argue it was certainly worth a risk compared to what the alternative is going to be. As you might imagine, since I already mentioned people are eating horses, the conditions inside the Kessel, or the cauldron as the Germans call it steadily worsen. Rations are cut and then cut again. For several weeks, your average German infantryman, he might get a slice of bread and a hunk of cold horse meat for the entire day. So these people, they start to lose immense amounts of weight. They start to get sick. There are points where there's not even enough fuel for them to melt snow so they have water to drink. The rat population inside the pocket explodes because there's so many dead horses and dead bodies for the rats to chew on. So the rats are all over the place and getting bigger and fatter. All the German troops suffer immense lice infestations. And I don't want to get too graphic, but I've read stories of, a wounded German soldier being brought into a field hospital inside the pocket. And the first thing the doctors do is they basically scrape off the lice with a spatula and throw it in the fire. So miserable conditions. You have a dysentery, you've got jaundice, you've got frostbite, all the things you might expect in this sort of situation. Horrible stories of surgeons or medics unwrapping the bandages from a wounded hand or foot, and the toes or fingers coming off with the bandage.
Oh, God.
Because of frostbite. Let's keep in mind that this is no picnic for the Red Army either, right? Even with proper equipment, you're still fighting outside in winter. This is a horrible life, but at least outside the pocket in the Red Army, you're properly equipped and you're properly fed.
Yeah.
Germans don't have those luxuries, and German soldiers really start to waste away. There are cases where German soldiers are so hungry they start to hallucinate.
Oh.
Which, that's not going to make you a very effective soldier. I mean, in a way, the amazing thing is how well the Sixth Army hangs on in the face of these horrible conditions. The
Yeah.
only good news into December, or through December for the Germans, is that the Soviets have ringed the pocket with 7 armies. And in hindsight, you could argue that maybe the Soviets shouldn't have devoted so many forces to trying to eliminate the pocket, but rather should have contained the pocket, knowing that it's going to starve itself out anyway, and
Right.
then divert more forces to your offensive that's now progressing further west. I'm just saying that from my standpoint, that might have been a better idea. In any case, the good news for the Germans is that the Sixth Army, in being surrounded, is tying down massive Soviet forces, 7 armies.
Yeah.
And so this relieves pressure on other parts of the Germans as they try to unwind the rest of this campaign. So, for example, the Germans don't start to withdraw Army Group A, which is still down in the foothills of the Caucasus. They don't start withdrawing it until December 31st, which I would argue is amazingly late.
Yeah.
And they are able to escape with most of it. And that's partly because they don't face overwhelming Soviet force, because so much Soviet force is encircling the Sixth Army back in Stalingrad, if that makes sense to people. Right.
Yeah.
So the rest of the German situation actually is not that bad. And it's partly because, and the Germans understand this, by the way. That's one of the reasons why, even after Winter Storm fails, Operation Winter Storm fails, the Germans want the Sixth Army not to surrender because they know that it's tying down all these Soviet forces, and so they can get the rest of their act together.
So how are the German troops handling this? Do we know what the German troops were thinking?
We do, especially these days. We have a lot of their letters. Now, first of all, I forget the number. I want to say about 35,000 Germans were evacuated by air from the pocket, mostly wounded.
Yeah.
So there are people who knew Stalingrad firsthand who do survive. So there are thousands of them. We also have a lot of letters that were sent from the pocket out on, basically a transport plane comes in, unloads its cargo, and picks up things like wounded and mail.
Yeah.
So we have some of their letters. Although it's interesting in this regard, one of the most famous works along these lines is a book called Last Letters from Stalingrad. It was published in German in 1950. It was published in English in 1956. It has very moving letters from some of these trapped German soldiers in Stalingrad. And today we know that this book is pretty likely a forgery. And and so, I mean, I would like to go and look back at some earlier histories of World War II that I'm sure rely on this book.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, not really. The real letters we have are generally pretty pathetic, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
We have all sorts of evidence that, as you might imagine, that to keep their hopes up, a lot of Germans in the pocket start to spread rumors that, the relief force is basically right down the road, that they're going to send some SS Panzer divisions. They're going to break in no time, right? You're basically wishful thinking. There's a lot of that in these letters.
Right.
Like clinging to the last bit of hope that a rescue is still coming. These troops have to spend an unbelievably sad Christmas in the ruins of Stalingrad, right? And they're in freezing bunkers and basements. They're thinking of home, obviously, and more of them are slowly realizing that they're probably never going to see home again.
Yeah.
What we also see in the letters, and this fits into some earlier things we've said in other shows, you see a lot of ideological commitment in these letters.
Now, this is fascinating because at this point you're writing a letter. Basically, you don't have much time and you don't have much space, but you're writing a letter and it includes ideological commitment to the Nazi thing.
Yeah. In other words, you're writing to your loved ones. You don't know if they're going to get this letter.
Yeah.
It may be the last letter you're able to write to them. And in it, you're going to say stuff like, yeah, things are really horrible here, but I'm doing my part to save Germany and the Führer. And because I believe in the cause. I mean, the sort of stuff that you might think is like, written by German propaganda or by some that is made up or whatever, that's forged, but it's not. So and this, we did a whole show about the clean Wehrmacht myth, right? The idea that the German army was apolitical and was just nationalist and they were anti-Nazi or non-Nazi or whatever. Once again, if you look at these letters, there's all sorts of indications. I think a whole book has been written about this by Omer Bartov. All sorts of indications that these, even though they may, there's a little voice in your head that says basically you're being sacrificed for no good reason. The more powerful voice in their head says this is worth it, that my sacrifice is for a great cause, that Nazi Germany and our beloved Führer Adolf Hitler, we will prevail, and it's all good.
Yeah.
And so
yeah.
It's real interesting in that regard.
And this is all this ideology has all been built up in less than 10 years, basically, because Hitler doesn't take power till 33, and this is 42, 43. This is amazing how strong that ideological commitment is.
Yeah, and also it's a really good point you make, and just to build on a little bit more, keep in mind that, if you're a 19-year-old fighting in Stalingrad, you were 10 when Hitler came to power.
Exactly. Exactly.
And so maybe you served in the Hitler Youth, you've been indoctrinated, you've been educated in a Nazified educational system. I would put it this way. We should be surprised if we didn't see a lot of ideological commitment in these letters.
Right.
And yet, I think that aspect often gets overlooked, right? The focus on the letters and the way the letters are used in a lot of the history focuses on sort of the human element, like how sad this is.
Yeah.
That they're trapped in this pathetic situation. But only recently have people like Omar Bartov been paying attention to the ideological aspect of this.
Okay, so that's the end of 42. So what happens in the new year 43?
As we turn into the new year. So January 7th, the Soviet commander who's now in charge, he's the commander of the Don Front. And the Soviets, they don't call them army groups, they call them fronts, but it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
The commander of the Don Front is a general by the name of Konstantin Rokossovsky, one of the top Soviet leaders of the war. He's going to be one of the people who's in on the defeat of Germany in 1945. Real interesting story. This is someone who was purged by Stalin in 1937.
Wow.
He was considered disloyal. He was sent to prison. I think it was only a fluke, only because of a fluke that he was not executed. He was released in 1940. And by the time you get to 1942, the Soviets had this great shortage of good generals. And so he's back in a very senior position. He's now given the job of crushing the pocket at Stalingrad. January 7th, he asks for Paulus's surrender. He basically says, look, you all are doomed. You're cut off. You're weak. We can stop the bloodshed right now. You'll be treated well. That was a lie, but you'll be treated well if you all surrender. Von Paulus asks Hitler again, like, can I surrender? Hitler refuses. And so Rokossovsky launches what's called Operation Ring. Not a terribly innovative name, but there you go. Operation Ring is launched on January 10th, basically from west to east. Logically enough, because, the Germans defending the pocket on the west side, they're basically out in the open. That's open terrain. Yeah. It's not built up. It's in winter. The Germans, in some cases, couldn't even dig proper foxholes because the ground is frozen solid. So the German defenses in the west are super weak, and so that's where the Soviets attack. They make very rapid progress. Germans are physically really not in a position to defend very well. They do their best, but they're so low on ammunition. There are all sorts of cases where the German defensive line, they wait. There's this old saying, wait until you see the whites of their eyes.
Yeah.
Back in the old days when weapons were inaccurate.
Yeah.
Well, weapons are more accurate now, but this is what the Germans are doing too. Is they want to make every shot count, so they wait until almost too late, until the Soviets are right up on them before they open fire, which they would never do,
right?
Unless they were
right.
just completely strapped when it comes to ammunition. So there's increase, and then there's some really pathetic scenes in the pocket after January 10th. The major German-controlled airfield inside the pocket is called Pitomnik, and there are increasingly desperate scenes, as you might imagine, at this airfield. The German military police, they struggle to control the crowds of wounded and stragglers who are desperate to get on what, for all they know, might be the last plane out.
Yeah.
There are even cases where an aircraft is all buttoned up, its engines are revved, it starts taxiing down the runway, and soldiers grab onto the outside of the plane. And then the plane goes into the air, and then one by one, the soldiers drop off to their deaths. You got to be pretty desperate to grab onto the outside of an airplane. But that does happen. And, there are all sorts of people who, basically do whatever they can to get on one of these airplanes. And by the way, some of these airplanes don't make it out.
Yeah.
Some of these airplanes, they get airborne. And the people who are on the airfield watch as it pulls off in the distance and then is immediately shot down and crashes and burns right outside the pocket. So it's lots and lots of sad scenes from the German standpoint. So between the 16th and the 22nd of January, the last German-held airfields in the pocket fell to the Soviets.
Yeah.
And, the Germans are increasingly pushed back toward the east into Stalingrad itself. So the pocket has collapsed from west to east. And then the Luftwaffe is reduced basically to dropping parachute canisters of supplies, correct. So these are quite large and heavy. You push it out of the plane, it has a parachute which slows it down, and it hits the ground, and you hope that it arrived intact. The problem with that is, it's winter, it's very windy.
To me.
You're not that accurate from the air. You don't know exactly where the front line is, and so, not surprisingly, a lot of these supplies, as far as we know, fall into the hands of the Red Army, and not into the hands of the Sixth Army, the German Sixth Army. Now, by the way, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. This was going to be a fraction of what they were getting when they had the airfields. So, but it's just sort of another pathetic last gasp. By January 25th, if people want a date, by January 25th, the Germans are driven back into the city of Stalingrad itself. And pretty quickly, the Soviets break through in the middle, and then the Germans are separated into two pockets, a northern pocket and a southern pocket. Paulus on that day again asks Hitler permission to surrender. He is again denied. January 30th, von Paulus notifies Hitler, basically, we are hours from collapse. Like we're down to our last ammunition, last food, last personnel, etc. Hitler responds with by giving out a series of promotions, including promoting von Paulus to field marshal.
Both of these parts, you were just talking about consistent grinding.
Yeah, I mean, if that sounds odd, which it certainly does.
What was the human toll of the battle?
For example, what has von Paulus done to deserve this promotion to the highest? By the way, field marshal is the highest rank in the German army. That's like general of the army or whatever. Anyway, it's some not very subtle messaging on Hitler's part. Hitler and von Paulus and everyone knows that in the history of the German army, going back to the days of Prussia, that no field marshal had ever surrendered. And so essentially it's an invitation to von Paulus to commit suicide.
The winning side.
Because the belief, Hitler certainly believed it, that no field marshal, no self-respecting field marshal should ever surrender. That would be a stain on the mark of the stain on the record of the German army. And so it's like I said, it's essentially an invitation to suicide. Von Paulus declines this invitation. He surrenders. So he was in the southern pocket. His command post was in the basement of a department store, and he surrendered the southern pocket on 31st of January. The northern pocket lasts a few days after that and surrenders on February 2nd, and so now the battle is over. The human toll is huge. The figures vary quite a bit, as you might imagine. So for the whole battle, so let's say counting for the battle for the city, counting between August of 1942 and February 1943, there were probably about 500,000 Axis dead. So remember, it's not just Germans, it's also Croatians and Italians and Romanians in particular, and what about Hungarians. About 500,000 Axis dead, probably around 1 million Soviet dead. So that's military dead. That's an enormous toll by any measure for a single battle. I mean, that's the kind of thing that puts Stalingrad up at the top ranks of battles in terms of human losses. I've seen it for the civilian deaths in Stalingrad. Remember that the civilians were there for the battle. Some could get away, some couldn't. I think most couldn't. About 40,000 civilians died. And just to put that in perspective, that's roughly the same death toll from the firestorm in Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah, August 1943, right, when the RAF
not very many.
And the U.S. Army Air Force bombed Hamburg so heavily for 6 days. It's about the same toll. I forget what the toll is for the whole Blitz, but I think it's also comparable there in terms
a few weeks ago about the
civilian loss of life. The Blitz
it's just an astounding story.
So obviously there are also massive losses in equipment, right? Tanks, aircraft, etc. Those far more readily replaced by the Soviets than by the Germans. So that's an additional problem for the Germans, and apart from the massive manpower losses.
Yeah, because it's too costly to have to try to get them back. Yeah.
Right. Von Paulus is not the only person who surrenders. The Sixth Army surrender. I think it's about 91,000 German prisoners of war fall into Soviet hands. As you might imagine, they are not treated very well, and they're not in very good shape to begin with. Remember, a lot of these people are essentially starving. A lot of these people are basically emaciated wrecks.
Yeah.
Some of them, have lost 40, 50 pounds. So they are forced to march. Remember, this is in the dead of a Russian winter. They're forced to march, a lot of them. Some of them are put to work. Some of them are put to work clearing the rubble in Stalingrad and cleaning up in the city itself. Some are loaded onto transports and transported to prisoner of war camps farther east, including in Siberia. Of those 91,000, about 5,000 survived the war. And here's what always blows me away is that the last of those 5,000 were only released in 1955.
Not bizarre, but this is suicidal.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty rare in history that is, as far as I'm aware, where POWs from a war are released only 10 years after the end of that war, and this was the result of an agreement between the Soviets and the West Germans. So yeah, 1955. There were a lot of
Wow,
wounded
hang on for a
Germans,
month.
obviously, who could not be evacuated, who were also captured. A lot of them were just shot on the spot, which is the sort of thing the Germans did all the time as well when they came across wounded Soviets. Right? We talked about this, right? The nature of the
By the
fighting
way,
in the
I
Eastern
want to
Front
insert
is so
another
brutal.
question
The
about
Heavies, right? These are the former Soviet prisoners
most
of war who had
important
been
battle of the war,
working for the
turning point of
Germans.
war.
Some of them I didn't know this. Some of them had
Before
actually
the
been
last
fighting
point,
alongside the
also
Germans
Stalin disaster part of the
in
big picture
Stalingrad, which
of
you can
of just
understand
between
considering the
to
situation.
overseeing
They know what
Bluefield and
happens to
also
them
Stalingrad.
if they get
I'll
taken
put in another
alive.
question about,
So they
I say this is a
and
piece,
some of
but
them
more
were,
often
and
said,
typically they were
going back
taken
to
out
the
and
first
shot.
point
Sometimes they
at
were
the beginning of the
interrogated or
first show.
tortured first and then
Okay.
shot, or I think some of them were also
Well,
sent
then
to
what
camps,
happened with the
to
military
labor camps.
situation after the battle?
Obviously, they were considered to be
What?
traitors by the Soviets,
You run out of batteries?
and the
Oh, shit.
most interesting thing to me from some of the recent
don't know.
evidence, by recent I mean maybe last 20 years, we have Soviet records now. So remember, the last formal surrender of Germans in the pocket is February 2nd, 1943. After February 2nd, according to Soviet
I think
records,
the only
another
way out of this is-
11,000 German troops fought on inside
Um,
Stalingrad in small groups. Yeah, when I learned that, I'm like, what? Like, seriously? Oh, well, at least a month
then
in
we'll
some
record
cases.
the rest another day.
According to the Soviet records, they didn't complete
that.
the mopping up until early March 1943, which is something we had no idea about for a long, long time. And, you can speculate. We don't know, obviously. I don't think any of them survived. But ideological commitment, maybe, or dread of capture, or both. I think a lot of them had essentially drunk the Nazi Kool-Aid, and the message seemed to be, we fight to the death when we're trapped. You save the last bullet for yourself, and so you just keep fighting. And the NKVD, they had their hands full with some of these small units or small groups of soldiers who just fought to the death. Right. Right. Yep. Yeah, and in my last paragraph, I'll also have added something about the longer term, like legacy, longer term impact. Okay. Military situation after the battle. So remember, the rest of the Germans in Operation Blue, like Army Group A in the Caucasus, they withdrew themselves pretty effectively, pretty successfully. They fall back up into the sort of eastern Ukraine, right to the west of the Don River. Certainly, the Soviets themselves, by February, their advance toward the west has become overextended. Von Manstein, the German commander now, he gets some permission to have some tactical retreats, which, remember, is not Adolf Hitler's thing. He also gets some pretty serious reinforcements, and then he counterattacks. So this is February, March 1943, and the Germans essentially restore. There's another battle for Kharkov. The Germans essentially reestablish the start line of Blue, sort of along the Mius River. So they Eastern Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, or I forget where the border is. It could be technically in southern Russia, but yeah. So it's basically that point where the Sea of Azov juts furthest up into the northeast. Basically from that point north, and then there is this bulge around Kursk. That's new, and that's going to lead to the last German offensive the following year. Speaking of which, the Germans do have enough combat power to manage one last offensive. It's even more limited than Blue. This is the one in July 1943, Operation Citadel. Big German offensive that failed miserably. With that exception, and like I said, that is a much more limited attack with a much more limited goal. Basically, the Germans have lost the initiative after Stalingrad, and the balance of forces on the Eastern Front is now way out of whack. And this is true if you look at manpower, certainly if you look at production, and certainly if you look at the rapidly increasing rate of the arrival of Lend-Lease aid from the United States and the United Kingdom. And absolutely, well, yeah, in enormous quantities. And this is, I've been reading a recent book, I think it's called Stalin's War. Maybe we can put that on the bookshelf as well. It goes into great detail about how crucial Lend-Lease aid was, not only to the Soviet war effort, but even as early as the Battle of Stalingrad. And basically, Stalin, the Soviets, they're a real difficult ally. We talked about this in other shows. They're incredibly demanding. They want everything yesterday, and Stalin in particular shows no regard for any difficulties that might be involved in supplying Lend-Lease aid or what might be causing a particular holdup. They want more, they want more, they want more. And then they will never acknowledge its importance and its role. And this is true long after World War II. And absolutely. We did it all by ourselves. And, occasionally, like I think in Zhukov's memoirs, he acknowledges the role of Lend-Lease. But, now we essentially, as historians, we have all the receipts. And in this case, literally the receipts. And the amount of materiel that was going to the Soviet Union was immense. And, for example, think about Operation Uranus, how big those breakthroughs were and how fast they accomplished the encirclement of Sixth Army. That's partly because of the Red Army's mobility. And the Red Army is mobile largely because of Lend-Lease aid, things like jeeps and Studebaker trucks and things like that. And so, yeah, the Soviets, certainly that's the nature of their regime. The Soviets are not, typically open to acknowledging this sort of thing, but as historians, we have to acknowledge it. And by the way, the amount of aid, especially in 1943, is just going to skyrocket. And when you correct. Yeah, in fact,
now, these are
the American military
canisters of
attaché
supplies?
in Moscow during the war, after the war, he wrote a book called Strange Alliance, which I think is just an awesome title and really does capture some of this. And, by the time you get to the battles of 1944, Soviet power is going to be overwhelming, and it's not entirely because of Lend-Lease. The Soviets themselves are doing great things with their industry, don't get me wrong, and might even have won on their own. But the victory over the Germans at Stalingrad and thereafter is greatly accelerated, I'll put it that way, by the arrival of increasing amounts of Lend-Lease of all kinds. Everything from locomotives to Spam. I mean, and millions of leather boots and things like that. So, as you might imagine, this battle, it has enormous effects on morale. The Germans realize, certainly German civilians do, and we have information about this. The German civilians learned about this battle, and basically the spin of the regime and Goebbels' propaganda machine, that spin didn't work. And German soldiers, German civilians, really for the first time start to realize that we are beatable, that we're not invincible, and that we may actually lose this war. And like I said, the propaganda spin, and it includes things like, the Nazi spin on Stalingrad was essentially we had to sacrifice the Sixth Army so that Germany might live. Or, they even drew the parallel to sort of the Spartans at Thermopylae. So in other words, I mean, they're doing their best to spin this into something that was worthwhile and meaningful, but they basically fail. And when it comes to morale, the reverse is also true. The Soviets, certainly never before on this scale, realize, wow, you know what? We can beat these guys.
Yeah, okay.
The invincible Wehrmacht is not invincible. That when we do things right,
Yikes.
we can destroy them. And yes, the Red Army is still suffering monstrous casualties, but they are improving across the board. And we talked about this in another episode. I'll say it again. It's not just about numbers. That is sort of an unfortunate Western stereotype that the Soviets just overwhelmed the Germans. It's we talked about this too. It's a parallel to the one take on the American Civil War that Grant beat Lee not because he was a good general, but he just sort of drowned Lee in superior numbers and superior firepower, and that's not true at all. Yes, the Red Army is numerically superior, but they also have
Well, the battle's
superior
over,
weapons
but
in a lot of
one
ways,
of the
like
things
the
we hear about
T-34
this
tank.
battle,
But they're
is that
also
the human
improving in
toll was
tactics.
so
They're improving in
massive. So
their
what was the
coordination of
human toll of the
combined
battle?
arms, right? Having all your different branches, like your armor and your infantry, and your air power and your artillery working together. They're improving in what's called a C cubed I, which I'm not going to go into depth, but basically it stands for command, control, communications, and intelligence. They're improving in all those branches. It's not just about numbers. And you see this in Operation Uranus. You see this in the Battle of Stalingrad more broadly. I'll put it very simply, probably overly simply, but an important aspect when it comes to morale and élan and esprit de corps when it comes to military affairs. One basic question is, are you in the other guy's head? I mean, are you in the other guy's head? And I'll use the Civil War analogy. Early in the Civil War in the Eastern Theater, Robert E. Lee had gotten into the heads of a lot of Union soldiers and Union commanders. Or look at North Africa. Erwin Rommel had gotten into the heads of a lot of Commonwealth commanders. On the Eastern Front, before Stalingrad, I'm putting this is an oversimplification, but I think there's something to it. Before Stalingrad, I would say that the Germans are in the Soviets' heads. And after Stalingrad, I think the Soviets are increasingly in the Germans' heads. If that makes sense. No, absolutely not. No, because there's more to warfare than just numbers, and there's more to warfare than just firepower.
Okay, then what happens to those who were captured by the Soviets, captured by the Red Army?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's difficult, and I guess you could say this is sort of a cop out. It's difficult to weigh things in terms of the relative magnitude. For example, I mean, if you look at the scale of the battle, Stalingrad is much, much bigger than, say, El Alamein. But, I mean, if you look at the German defeat in North Africa more broadly, which is happening at roughly the same time, if you look at what we talked about this in the Operation
we
Torch
did another
episode,
show on this.
if you look at the toll on the Germans,
just astounding.
When they surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, Goebbels called that a second Stalingrad. So that's actually comparable. And my point is to put, it is too. I'll put it this way: it's too simple to say the German defeat of Stalingrad was the turning point in the war, period. I don't think you can say that. It may be the turning point in the war on the Eastern Front, which makes it important enough by a mile. But I'd say look at chronology, look at the timing. World War II lasts, depending upon how you count, 6 years, 8 years, in a relatively brief chunk of that period. So I'm talking November 1942 to May 1943. The war in Europe. Look what happens. Rommel is defeated at El Alamein. Operation Torch is launched, 11 days before Uranus? So, the timing for the Germans is horrible. And we talked about this, right? Hitler decides to reinforce North Africa, turns out a day late and a dollar short, on a massive scale. And that means troops and transport aircraft that could be helping out the Sixth Army are going to North Africa, right? The Germans are spread too thin. So Operation Torch, the seizure of Allied North Africa, I mean, that's May 1943 when that's completed. That's just a few months after the German defeat at Stalingrad. And then also, finally, let's not forget the definitive defeat of the U-boats in the Atlantic. Also May 1943.
Wow.
So I would say all these things together, and once again, you can argue that's a cop-out, like you're just throwing them together, right?
A
throw the,
month.
add these elements and stir. So I realize in terms of precise causality, it may sound like a cop out,
Lordy,
but I
lordy.
think in the broader scheme, everything is turning. All the major ways in which the war is turning against the Germans happens at roughly the same time. They're basically losing on all fronts, including, by the way, the front in the air, right? Operation Gomorrah, the flattening or the incineration of Hamburg, that's July 1943. So in a relatively brief period, the Germans are going to find it increasingly difficult to play this game of whack-a-mole, which, like I said, they're spread too thin. They can't. They can't.
Oh
They call
yeah.
off their
By the
Kursk
way,
offensive. I think I mentioned this in another episode.
Off,
July
off
1943.
camera
They
here.
call off their Kursk
Remember, I
offensive.
said I was
Why?
going to
They have to
add
rush
an additional question
more
here
divisions to
before
Italy because
last
the
point,
Allies have
before
invaded
also
Sicily
Stalingrad, getting
at
back
almost
to,
exactly the same
well, was
time.
this the most
Operation
important
Husky.
battle of the war? The question
So
is
the
the
Germans are
biggest
constantly moving things around. They don't have enough
so
stuff.
Is, okay.
And I'll say one other thing about this, and about Stalingrad in particular, and this I think will get a little more specific, which is to say, the Soviet victory at Stalingrad helps determine the shape of the end of the war, in that it's going to help bring the Soviets into Eastern Europe faster and earlier than they would have otherwise. I mean, obviously it's the counterfactual game, but imagine a Soviet defeat at Stalingrad, or they don't have the massive victory at Stalingrad. Maybe they don't advance as far west as they do in 1943 and 44. Maybe then the Western Allies basically beat them to Berlin. I mean, those are all conceivable scenarios without a major victory at Stalingrad when it happens. And that has implications in some ways we're still dealing with today, right? The fact that the Soviet Union is brought into Eastern Europe, and it's one of the great moral tragedies and moral complications of World War II is that to defeat Hitler, to save half of Europe, we have to sacrifice the other half, basically, where they swap a Nazi dictatorship for a communist dictatorship. I mean, that's really, really sad. But there's no doubting this is a massive victory. A brilliant achievement for the Red Army, a huge boost for the Allied war effort in Europe in general. But once again, let's not forget, it just came at an enormous cost. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. And just to put this in perspective once again, I mean, if let's say the Soviets lose 1 million military dead in the Battle of Stalingrad, that's more military dead on the Soviet side in the Battle of Stalingrad than the United Kingdom and the United States lost in the entire war combined. So, I mean, that right there, and once again, please don't misunderstand me. I am not somehow belittling the contributions and sacrifices of Americans and Britons and Commonwealth people from all over the world. I'm not at all doing that. I'm just saying that this puts it in perspective, right? This is a single big battle where yes, it's a huge victory, but it comes at an enormous cost to the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You are most welcome.
Yeah, you see this in Russian propaganda after the war. We did it all on our own. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they're not going to say thanks to the capitalists we helped win this battle. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Exactly. Uh-huh. Oh, wow. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 Oh, okay. That's an interesting way to put it. Yeah. 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 Ah, yeah. Yeah. Hmm. And that's not insignificant at all. Yeah. Well, Professor, at the very beginning of episode one, the first part of the Stalingrad series, said, we often think of this as the most important battle of the war, the turning point of the war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've throughout these two shows have what we call in the history game complicated that notion in a good way. You've shown how complicated it is, and we have to talk about it in more detail and more context. But really, what part does this play in the turning of the war? Like, I suppose is my final question. Yeah, 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 yeah. Right. Yeah, and yeah, faster. Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, the cost is really, really terrible. And I'd like to point listeners to a show we did a few years ago called Why Was World War II So Bad? In which you talked about in depth the number of casualties, especially the civilian casualties, and how they were spread around the globe. To remind ourselves that, the heroism is extremely important and should be celebrated because it stopped, bigger evils, but the death toll is just, well, stratospheric. Yeah, that's astounding. Well, there you have it, Buzzkillers. Once again, complications are all part of history, an all essential part of history. We can't oversimplify. So let me just thank Professor Nash for coming back on the show to finish up this Stalingrad episode. And please go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com, do everything you need to do there, sign up for our newsletter, support us on Patreon, look at the Buzzkill bookshelf, and we will talk to all of you next week.